Good afternoon. My name is Ann Hinton, and I'm a volunteer advisor with AARP California. Welcome to everyone who's joining us today. Today we are live with Dr. Anna Chodos, Director of 80 over 80 San Francisco, and Noelle Grace, who is the Program Manager with 80 over 80 San Francisco. They are going to share more about their campaign to honor history and the contributions of San Francisco's diverse older adult population through the stories of 80 individuals over 80. We encourage you to share this stream now on your own social media page so interested friends and family may also participate in today's conversation. And we invite you to ask Dr. Chodos and Noelle questions in the comments. We will take a few questions live toward the end of our conversation. Dr. Chodos, it's really nice to see you again. And Noelle, thank you for joining us today. Wondering if you can tell us about yourselves and your work.
Thank you, Anne, and such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for hosting this, and thank you to AARP. We're so excited to get the project out there, so it's a wonderful opportunity for us. So I'm a geriatrician, which is a physician that cares more specifically for older adults, though I also do general internal medicine. I work at UCSF and I do education and clinical care. And my clinical care is at San Francisco General in the clinics there and the associated San Francisco Health Network. So clinically, I work with low-income older adults almost exclusively. And this particular project is a passion project. So it is, of course, inspired by my work and all the wonderful community organizations I get to work with that also serve older adults and have taught me a lot about older adults' lives and how they're lived in San Francisco. But this isn't part of my actual job. And so it's just been a really nice part, I guess, of my life for the last 3 years to get to do this project.
And Noelle?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Noelle Grace. I'm the program manager of 80 over 80 San Francisco. I've had the enormous pleasure of working with Dr. Anna Chodos on this project since I joined in May 2020. So it's been a long project, but it's been a great deal of fun. And I was motivated to join because my own dad is actually 84 years old. He has advanced Parkinson's disease, and I served as his caregiver. So I've seen the effects of aging and of ageism firsthand. So yeah, very excited to be here with you all to discuss 80 over 80.
Yeah. So what exactly is 80 over 80 and how did the project come about?
Yeah, so we are trying to keep it somewhat simple. We talked to now, we're done, 80 older adults who live in San Francisco. So those were the only two criteria, that you were 80 years old or older and lived in San Francisco. It came about after I was coming home one day and collecting the mail and had two separate magazines, which we no longer subscribe to, that had 30 under 30 and a 40 under 40. And whereas I think we all really appreciate the contributions of particularly successful, younger adults in our society, I think particularly as a geriatrician already being primed in this way, I really was kind of had that fed up feeling, I guess I would say, or frustrated feeling of thinking, youth culture is great, achievement oriented celebrations are great, but we are an aging city. The whole country's aging, as we know, but demographically, we have an unprecedented number of older adults proportionally in our society. And the oldest old, as we sometimes say, but just people in their 85 and up age range are the fastest growing demographic. And that's presumably permanent. Obviously, the world is changing a whole lot these days, but really just wanted to celebrate and give voice to those older folks for the sheer fact that being older is historically a huge deal, having this many older people be part of our society. And the other thing we know is that ageism is a problem. It's a problem for all of us in the sense that we don't really think of ourselves as older. Many people who aren't yet older aren't really fully envisioning their full lifespan, I think, because of ageism. We know that structural ageism is a big problem in healthcare and employment. And one solution is representation, more visibility, more access to older adults' faces and voices. So that was another way that I was really hoping that this project would help essentially our community, because our community, our city, San Francisco, which I think a lot of people have a lot of pride and excitement about being in San Francisco, from San Francisco, whatever that means. If you've been here for 10 years, you're kind of from San Francisco. There's a lot of pride in how wonderful a city it is, how progressive, how forward thinking. But this is an area where I don't think we're really there yet, and not forward thinking enough in terms of thinking about our community as all of the people that are there. And in San Francisco, that is a lot of older people. So just trying to broaden everyone's idea of who is this city, who are we? And so then I just recruited a lot of volunteers, and Noelle has been the first and the longest in many ways. And I can't even tell you how many younger people have joined and are really helping make this project happen. And I really love that about the project as well, that 80 over 80 is an intergenerational project for sure.
That's great. With the project being set in San Francisco, and of course, I'm located just outside of San Francisco, I'm curious about what you learned about aging in San Francisco. What's working well, and what are some of the challenges to the city's aging population?
We actually asked that question specifically. What do you like about San Francisco? And then what could be better? Because I was hoping, I can't help it. I truly dibble dabble. I'm a dilettante in research, but I do it occasionally. And, wanted to think, what are we going to learn? What are we going to be able to contribute forward that our supervisors, our planners are going to be thinking about? And I thought I would hear things that people really framed in terms of now that I'm older, ... I wouldn't say that was the case at all. So that actually was kind of surprising that people really said the same things we're all thinking about. And people were concerned about housing for themselves. They're concerned about transportation and accessibility and reach, because that was key for them. And they were very concerned. I would say this was sort of a big theme, was concerned about people who are living unhoused. And it's clear that weighs on all of us. It weighs on all of our hearts and minds, those of us who do have housing and really are concerned for that population. So in some ways it was like reinforced the fact that we're all kind of on the same page as a city and a community in those aspects.
Noelle, anything that stands out for you?
Yeah, just to add on to that, I think we're so lucky to live in such a diverse city. And I hope that we've captured a lot of that diversity in this project. I think in so many ways, we've really realized that people love San Francisco and really love the people in it. And specifically, they love kind of the cultural activities. So like the orchestra, the opera, the many opportunities to volunteer, to be active, to meet people from a lot of different backgrounds. But I think like every city, we do have our shortcomings, and finding solutions to those issues is important, not only for people over 80, but for every age range. So specifically, I think some of our interviewees have touched on, concerns such as the discontinuation of certain public transit lines, the high cost of living, the difficulty in running errands and finding groceries in a city that's not very walkable, harassment and prejudice, and then maybe feelings of isolation, mainly due to the COVID-19 pandemic and the cessation of a lot of those activities.
Yeah, and that brings me to my next question, which includes something about the pandemic. A lot of the project was filmed during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I wonder, Dr. Chodos, are there any stories of resilience that stand out to you?
Yeah, well, that is something that stands out in general. So that's one thing I really love about getting to know more older people, as someone who maybe just going about my business, work and dropping off a certain someone at elementary school, I wouldn't necessarily be interacting with quite so many people in their 80s and 90s.
Right.
But I think that's a really wonderful thing about talking to so many older adults, is resilience is sort of baked in. People have lived through a lot, and they speak about it in a way that is clearly represents the resilience that they have. And I would say the resiliency really came out around issues of disability and how people adapt to new disabilities and, live their lives regardless. So really, I think taking a notch down out of, the sort of also ableist stuff that's out there, that once you're disabled, somehow you don't have a life worth living. Like, that really was not the case at all. Everyone was living with disability, or most people had some amount of disability. And then COVID-19, it was more of an adjustment, but some people were feeling more socially isolated, and you could tell had to really, people, a lot of people talked about not being able to see friends and family. Of course, one woman, Carol Perlman, who is I really highly recommend her interview. She's very, very funny. She lived in an assisted living, and she's a writer, and she has a lot of books on Amazon. But she's on oxygen, so you can see her wearing it during the interview. And she's in an assisted living that was having a COVID outbreak. And you could kind of hear the fear in her voice at the time.
Yeah.
And she was really, really missing her grandchildren, which was one of the reasons why she moved to San Francisco. So that was a big deal for her. So I think the same thing that was, again, the same thing that was going on for all of us, that we were being cut off from that level of social interaction, which is so critical for all of us. Another person, Berta Vasquez, was, absolute regular at the Unlock 30th Street Senior Center.
Mm-hmm.
And being cut off from that, she got really depressed. So she's one person. I would say most people who participated, I think for understandable reasons, were in a good place emotionally and mentally and willing to participate, probably partly for that reason. But she was going through depression, and we talked to her recently, and she really admitted to not feeling well and feeling really socially isolated. So she was someone who, I think, that psychological toll of the pandemic was really apparent. But a clear theme for me after having listened to them all again, is just how resilient human beings are. And that's something, again, I personally really look forward to. We know there are challenging times in life, but I take some comfort. I know people who all went at various times in their lives through something that was challenging and came through it with,
Yeah. And Noelle, can you share some stories that you found particularly interesting or inspiring?
Yeah, sure. So, I think every story honestly was interesting and unique in its own way. And I think something that I've really gained and appreciated about this project is that it gives you, in a very quick period of time, the ability to really intimately connect with someone and get to know someone on an intimate level. And I think that empathy and that bond is really the foundation of building a sense of community. So I think one story that specifically stands out, Anna and I both really appreciate this man, Andy Morgan. He was age 90 and a Holocaust survivor. And he has such a positive, spiritually guided outlook on life. I can read a quote from his interview. He says, "The most important thing in life is to love everybody unconditionally. Never harbor any hatred towards anybody. Never, ever close your heart to anybody." I thought that was really nice.
Wow.
And I also personally did an interview with a woman named Brenda Joyce, age 80, who's looking for a job. I think she just found one in San Francisco in her 80s. And her whole life, she's kind of gone against the norm. She decided never to have children and has spent a lot of her adulthood traveling. So that's been a really special one for me. I find a lot of inspiration in that one. And we also feature interviews with a few better known San Franciscans. So for example, we have local legend Diamond Dave Whitaker. He mentored a young Bob Dylan, and Orlando Cepeda, who many of you will know is a San Francisco Giants player, a former San Francisco Giants player, and also a baseball Hall of Famer. And so those are just a few of the 80s. Again, each one is very special and unique, and just a great way to get to know the people in our community.
Thank you. Dr. Chodos, you're a geriatrician, as you mentioned earlier. I'm curious if and how the story collection experience from the 80 over 80 campaign influenced the way you practice medicine.
In a way, this was a nice respite from the typical, I would say, over medicalized lens I'm taking to my interactions with older people. But I think the thing, honestly, that's already emphasized in geriatrics is the context of the person and everything that makes their life worth living. And one thing I did appreciate from a couple participants, um, one was is Fanny Clark, who was 86 when we talked to her, and she's a Black woman who at one time in her life was single. It was actually much earlier in her life, not recent, but she had a lot of sort of unidentifiable symptoms. And she described being really discounted by healthcare providers. And I know personally, one thing that motivated me to do this project was the ageism in healthcare.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, she really highlighted, at least in that time in her life, she felt like it was because she was a woman and she was Black and she was single. And so the way that we really need to listen, and I think in some ways, I hope I kind of honed that skill a little better. It was actually such a joy to just have a reason to sit and listen to somebody talk for an hour or more.
Mm-hmm.
And not have my phone on and not have other things pinging and dinging. So, and then the other person more recently was Janie Bell, who's almost 90 and only retired a couple of years ago, dedicated her whole life to recreational and educational programs for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And just, just trying to imagine the impact she's had on so many people's lives.
Right.
And in the city is almost overwhelming. But she was having, symptoms and health issues and really struggling to be taken seriously by her physicians, in her view. I only had her perspective, but I think that's something that I really heard, I guess, that, people really need to feel cared for. It's not about necessarily, we may not always have treatments for everything or a cure, but we really want to make sure that people feel that they're getting care and feeling cared for. So that's something I took away. Yeah.
Well, questions are building up in the queue, but
Okay.
before we go there, where can folks view the 80 stories, and what is your hope that viewers will take away from watching the videos? Noelle, what thoughts?
Yes, so we're very happy that we've teamed up with a local San Francisco radio station, KALW San Francisco, and they'll be airing 14 of our interviews starting in May from Mondays to Thursdays at 5 p.m. on their show Cross Currents with Hana Baba. We also have a website, 80over80sf.org. It'll be linked here. And there on May 2nd, we'll be posting all of the interviews that we have as well as other resources. We also have a social media presence, both on Instagram and Facebook at 80over80sf.
Thank you. So our first question is, are you still collecting stories?
Yes, it's a good question, I should say. Sorry. I wouldn't mind keeping track if there are people we should talk to, but at the moment we're really focused on just making sure everything is listenable or watchable. So we have video, audio, and a few written, people who didn't want their faces or voices displayed, which we tried hard to make sure people felt comfortable, because it's kind of a big deal to put yourself out there.
Sure.
So, but I wish I could do this forever. I'm wondering if maybe I will once this is wrapped up. But I think for the moment we're putting a pin in it. But if you have somebody who you think would be great, I think we'll once we get a couple decent nights sleep, we'll probably think about what's next for this project.
Okay, and that actually leads right into the next question. Are there other 80 over 80 projects in other cities? Great idea.
So, yeah, I did talk to somebody in, oh my God, now I have to remember where University of Arizona is. I think is it in Phoenix or Tucson? Well, I've been talking to people there about, they're thinking of doing their own. It's actually, it'd be really easy to sort of, if you will, hand over a template and a lot of advice about how to do it well the first time. We had to go back to a few people, I have to say. So it's not like a franchise or anything, at this point. There is an 80 over 80 in Texas, I believe, and we weren't able to get the 80over80.org website for that reason. So I think clearly other people have had the idea. Obviously the idea of just a list of people, certain age, certain number isn't like the most original idea. But I think like there's a 70 over 70 podcast out there. There's a 50 over 50. I can't remember with which group. But a lot of people have thought that way to really highlight the contributions of older people. I want to say one thing I forgot to mention is we really didn't want to focus on super agers. I take to heart a lot what I would say a mini mentor has said to me, Judy Goddess, who we profile for this project, but she's the editor at SF Senior Beat, which is an online newspaper magazine. And Judy says, for normal people normally aging, attention must be paid. And I really take that to heart, because I think the point here is that we are aging in a way as a society, and that means individual people as well, that we never had before. And that's actually pretty exceptional. And that's kind of full stop for me. It's not really about, are you doing XYZ at certain age, which is, so surprising. It is wonderful to celebrate people who are, teaching yoga in their 90s. Of course, it's really cool. It's absolutely cool. But there's so much else about aging that is really cool and exceptional and already isn't emphasized. So I would point out we have a couple of people who had names for themselves already, but really this is a lot of your neighbors and your community members. And somebody did ask like what made age 80 so special. I will say that the reason we did 80 over 80 as opposed to 70 over 70, 60 over 60, other than it did certainly mean we had to collect a lot more interviews, is 80, I think a lot of people feel comfortable being identified with being older, and people in their 60s and 70s, it's a little, there's so much internalized ageism, and that's not a ding on anybody who sort of doesn't identify that way, but we had a lot of people turn us down, actually, even in their 90s, because they felt like being associated with something about older people wasn't for them.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I don't think we have any other questions at this time. I want to thank you, Dr. Chodos and Noel. And for those of you joining us late, we had a wonderful opportunity to speak to Dr. Anna Chodos, director of the 80 over 80 San Francisco project, and Noel Grace, who is the program manager for 80 over 80 San Francisco. We've learned about their campaign to honor the history and contributions to San Francisco, from San Francisco's diverse older adult population, through the stories of 80 individuals. I'm looking forward to seeing all of them, actually. You can learn about the project at 80over80sf.org. Dr. Chodos and Noel, thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure talking with you, and nice to meet you, Noel. And to our viewers, we hope you will all have a wonderful day. Thank you for joining us for an AARP California Webinar Wednesday conversation. Good afternoon.
Thank you.
You.